Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm joined today by Robin and John from Shaggy Dog Publishing.
Shaggy Dog Publishing is probably a reasonable name.
Yeah. Most people will know them from various work throughout the hobby industry over the last decades. I'll not dwell on that too much, but you are both very welcome today to talk about talking miniatures.
Well, thank you. It's a delight for you to invite us, I think.
Very exciting.
So for people who have missed out on the big grand reveal that this book was coming, before we get into the actual minutiae of what's in there and what people can expect from it, I just want to ask a quick question: is what sparked the idea to actually put it together?
You want to answer this, John, or shall I answer this one?
Oh, you have a go.
I'll have a go, and you can pitch in. We can grumble. It was a long time ago. We were somewhere at the tail end of 2016. It might have been 2017. John and I were just sitting having a cup of tea in his back garden, and we were just ruminating on the passage of time and the roaring monster that Games Workshop has now become. Phenomenally successful company, and we're saying, God, we couldn't have imagined this all those years ago. And we realized as it moved into its fifth decade, it's 40 years since Warhammer was released, and that was a decade after Stephen Ian founded the company, of what it had become. And actually here we are on the edge of collecting our pensions. And so we just said, somebody should write some of this down before we get too old and decrepit to remember it all.
Otherwise, nobody will believe it.
Nobody will believe us. They just wouldn't believe us. And so we kind of had a couple of false starts at the start of 2017. How are we going to do this? Do we write a history? How do we get this down? And we got a bit stuck. And then towards the end of 17, so, almost a year after the original germ of the idea, we went over to see Rick Priestley. We're both friends with Rick. We've known Rick for more years than you can remember. And I said, look, let's go and see Rick. I'm going to take my recorder. I've got a little 8-track digital recorder. We put it on the table and we had a conversation with Rick. Rick, how did you come to work for Games Workshop then, mate? That kind of conversation. And this conversation went on for about an hour and a half. And we went back and we listened to the tapes and went, shit, that was amazing. Because what we didn't get was we didn't get an interview. Lots of these people that we talked to in the book, they've been interviewed before. And the interview tends to be kind of, oh, Mr. Priestley, please tell us your wisdom. It's very deferential because he's Rick and he's lovely. And his contribution to the hobby is, we can't measure it over the last 3 or 4 decades. But what we got was 3 old mates chatting about shit from the past. And when one of us kind of had a memory, it would spark a memory in the other, and John would tell a story and Rick would burst out laughing, and it just became ridiculous. And we did that and we kind of went, God, that's really magical. I've never seen that before. And then so in 2018, the 3 of us, we did a road trip down to Carbis Bay in Cornwall to go and spend a night in the pub and a morning with Tony Ackland, because Tony and Rick were the original Games Workshop design studios. The 2 of them put Warhammer together 40 years ago. And so we did the same thing. We put the recorder on the table and said, let's just talk. What about the old days then, folks? And again, we got another fantastic interview. And then suddenly John and I had a light bulb moment and said, why don't we just go and talk to people? And we'll talk to people and we'll capture the recordings. And then we'll see where we get to with that. And so we went off and then we talked to, after Tony Ackland, I think it was Trish Carden, miniature sculptress. And then we saw Andy Chambers. And then we we just kept rolling.
Yeah.
And that's how the book came about. John.
Yeah, and we got 17 desperados together, really. We couldn't, unfortunately, get people who are currently working at Games Workshop because that's not their style. That's not how they roll. So we found 17 great people who will give very different views on what they remember happening at Games Workshop in those days. And it became fairly... pretty soon, we knew that Sir Ian Livingstone was bringing out his book, The Dice Man, and his is a far more historical view about the history of Games Workshop. And it's a jolly good book, and everybody should go and buy one.
Yeah.
But ours is certainly not a history of Citadel or Games Workshop. It's 17 views into exciting days and broadly in the 1980s, but not exactly the 1980s.
Okay. It was interesting because the thing that struck me from the little excerpts I've managed to see the famous TV show, The World at War, when they decided to do that, it was a case of we're reaching that point where the people who were participating in the various military actions, they're reaching a certain age. We're no longer going to have them around, so we need to get it down. We need something sort of recorded. And this, for a little small segment of time in Games Workshop, it feels like that. It feels like having a chat with people and seeing their point of view and how things developed as well. Because, like you say, Games Workshop is a behemoth these days.
Absolutely.
It's like a black
Leviathan.
Hole. It distorts everything. Yeah, very much so. It distorts the whole hobby around it. But when it started, it was just another small company. But this period, the sort of the as you termed it, I think the golden years, or as a lot of other people would call it, the red period.
The red period.
That period from
the Goblin Green period.
Yeah. From mid 80s to mid 90s, a decade shaped not only Games Workshop, but also so many people's perceptions of what a games company was, how it should be run, and also brought it into a larger scope as well, because there was nothing Games Workshop like out there. There was no hobby stores that you would walk into, certainly not in Northern Ireland anyway. You know, if you were lucky, you would find little racks of stuff maybe squirreled at the back of a model shop or
Mrs. Megan's model shop.
Yeah, exactly. that sort of thing. So yeah, this, and you've already alluded to the fact it's 2 volumes. The Talking Miniatures book is a little window on this time period as well.
It's exactly that, and because what we really want, once we started this process, what we really want to capture the people's stories. So if you read through the book, you'll actually find it's not consistent. In places it's contradictory, because somebody remembers it one way and somebody remembers it another way.
Yeah.
But we thought that's part of the charm. This is not a top-down production. Mm-hmm. It's a bottom-up conversation is what's happening. So the people, they say what they say and they remember what they remember. That being said, there are some amazing stories in that book. I mean, I know that you've seen bits of it, but Bob Naismith's story about how the Space Marine backpack was based on the nested doughboy backpack from World War II American soldiers. You go, I didn't know that. John didn't know that. We've known Bob Naismith for decades, but until we sat down, and I went, really, Bob? So I then obviously went Googled doughboy backpack and found the pack. And went, shit, that's the Space Marine backpack with the bedroll across the top. That is now the air vents. You go, how cool is that? How cool is that?
There's nothing new under the sun, is there, really? Let's be honest.
And that's just an example of what's in this book, what's in that, those personal stories, those personal memories, those personal recollections of what it was like working, because there wasn't a big plan. We were making it up as we went along. We were winging it, seat of the pants stuff. That's what's in there.
I think you'll find in the chapters, Robin and I, we broadly let the interviewee just go. They go with the flow, and they'll go with something. They've got a strong line, and we'll keep egging them on to get more and more out of that story if it's a good one. Occasionally, we'll have to rein them in, but i.e., trying to get any sense out of the 2 Perry twins at the same time is almost impossible. They talk over each other beautifully, and they're just like great fun. But the stories are all interesting, all amusing.
Yeah. Well, I'm always put in mind of Alan and Michael at the back of Rogue Trader with the "I am." So am I.
Yeah, exactly.
It feels there was an awful lot of truth into that illustration.
Well, it was a nightmare, of course, because we did the recordings, and then we had another colleague, Helen, who actually appears in the book, who was one of the women behind the scenes at Games Workshop. We sent the tapes to her, and she lives in Ireland, and she did the transcripts. So she then sent me the Word documents back. And in the case of the Perry interview, she just kind of called me up and said, "I've no idea who's talking here. I can't tell the 2 of them apart."
Oh, I love that. If we have a quick look at the contents, because this is quite interesting as well. Quickly throw that up there. The book itself then is actually 2 volumes.
It is.
Now, was that intentional from the start?
No.
To go for volume 1 or volume 2?
No,
like the history of Games Workshop, we made it up as we went along.
Good.
We really did. No, there was no intention to do volume 1 and volume 2. What we did is we went out and talked to these 17 people. And John and I are in every interview as well. And each interview, when it was edited, was about 10,000 words, 10 to 12,000 words. So my cat's just meowing outside the door, if that's what you can see here. And so, that was 200,000 words plus. And then by the time I'd done a rough layout in Word and selected and started to source images, we had 500 pages. And you can't physically bind 500 pages without the spine cracking and falling apart. Mm-hmm. And John and I went, what should we do? Should we cut some stuff out? And we both went, nah, this is all really cool.
It would have been a terrible shame to lose any of that. Yeah.
We just thought we can't do that. We can't cut it. So we went, oh, come on, let's bite the bullet. We'll do 2 books, 2 volumes. We'll put them together in a really lovely slipcase and slipcover and make this a thing to treasure. Because for John and I, this has been a labor of love.
Yeah.
We worked on this for 5 years now, heart and soul, because we wanted to do something great for fans and enthusiasts. And we are those fans and enthusiasts ourselves. So that's why.
Yeah, I think that comes across in the interviews as well. And I see certainly in the Tony Ackland interview, or chat rather, there's often times where something triggers a little story, which triggers a story, which then diverts into something entirely different. It's like, the Tom Meyer brought green stuff into sculpting. It's like, what? I'm just going little detours and deviations. And it sounds like so many friends just sitting, having a chat in the bar about, do you remember when? And it's a very much a nostalgia trip, but there are so many little gems and nuggets throughout that.
Sorry to cut in there. Sorry,
Robin's
Robin's done an awful lot of the donkey work here, and by cutting in with those wonderful white dwarves that relate to that time, or that shop opening, or that release relating to that, that's absolutely hits those pleasure spots you were talking about there, and you think, oh, I remember buying that, and it's very pleasurable.
Well, I found that particularly looking through the stuff where we're looking back towards the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and learning all about how that came to be in the genesis of that. Because I dived into that, and I obviously played through first edition, second edition, all these things. But I'd never obviously, because it was essentially a little bit of a fringe project alongside all the other big projects that Games Workshop was working on at the time. A lot of that history of how that came to be wasn't something that I was, readily aware of, but then having all of those stories and the way that the art came together and everything else that sort of went alongside that was just fascinating. I think that draws into that idea of these are stories that need to be told and need to be out there from all these people that were right there at that moment. It was very cool. Yeah.
No, and that's what the book is. It's people telling their own stories in their own words. And you're right, Gerry. It's just, is it for 3 or 4 old mates sitting around chatting? Yeah, of course it is. That's exactly what it is. And, obviously we started out seeing people face to face, drinking endless cups of tea. Then pandemic came along in the middle of it. And so we switched to Zoom, just like this kind of conversation. So Trish Carden and Mike McVeigh, who lives now up in the Lake District, we couldn't get to see Mike. And so we had a fantastic conversation with Mike on the phone. Again, stuff that I didn't know anything about, even though I've known Mike for decades. And that's what's so exciting to us about the book.
Things like Mike being drafted in for 2 weeks to do a bit of freelance and then ending up painting a vast majority of the Rogue Trader miniatures from the actual book as well. It's actually,
and I'm sure you've seen in the book, Mike actually sent his rejection letter from John Blanche that we printed in the book. And actually, he tells that story in the book. And I would say now he was 18 and he turned up for this interview with John Blanche. And John had his classic Minotaur with the Mona Lisa banner on the shelf behind him. And as Mike tells it, he just sat there with his eyes on stalks looking at this thing on the shelf. And John kind of went, this guy's clearly a nutter, no job for him.
So the book more or less takes us through a period where Games Workshop was, I wouldn't say in flux, but finding its feet and developing. So you went from having 2 head offices, one in London, one in the north, and then the sort of the move from London to Nottingham, and then multiple moves within Nottingham then as things expanded or things changed. How did you find that? As being there at the time, was John, it a case of we need to make the room, and then making the room informs where you're going to go next? Or was it the sort of the bringing together various elements?
John, you should answer that, because I was a latecomer. I didn't rock up till 89 and at Enfield Chambers. So, John.
Well, one of the things that you'll find as you get through the book is the name of Brian Ansell will come up time and time again in 17 chapters. And Steve and Ian, God bless them, without them, we wouldn't be here talking now, that's for sure. They've told their story quite well, and it's a great story. I mean, they saw a gap and they went for it, and they restore. And but the other main man is Brian, who is very much a Renaissance man, but also a man who liked to live in Nottingham. And when Steve, Ian, and Brian were all working together, if you read their book, you know, they would have differences of opinions and things, and that's fine. And but Brian never wanted to go down to London ever, and nor did any of us really. We were these bunch of Northerners, really, if you like, who I think we were all a bit scared about living in London. I don't think we really understood London. Now, the guys down in London, of course, they love their hometown. And when it was decided that the two companies should merge, most of them didn't move up to Nottingham. It just didn't fit their lifestyle. No, thank you. So we had 4 or 5 at best came up to Nottingham, Jervis and Lindsay Priestley being 2 of them, Rick's wife, and who helped edited this book, in fact. So the move was not without its sadness. Certainly, Park Royal down in London, that's where they used to be, all came up to Eastwood, an old mining town, just like that, 8 miles out of Nottingham, I guess. And it all fitted into one big warehouse. And that's when, as you know, Games Workshop decided that we'd go down the Warhammer route and the Citadel Miniatures route, as Robin alluded to, that it's Citadel Miniatures became the dominant part of the partnership, if you like, as the brand name for all the miniatures. And Warhammer Fantasy and then Warhammer 40K was the vehicle, really, for moving it towards the mighty Games Workshop Warhammer that we know of today and still do.
Yeah, because that's something people probably wouldn't expect or know. Well, depending on your age, was that Games Workshop and Citadel Miniatures were separate and distinct at the beginning. And even then, Citadel wasn't alone in supplying models for Warhammer, because you had Marauder and all sorts as well.
It's not quite true to say they're separate and distinct. Citadel was created as a joint partnership between Brian Ansell and Steve Jackson, Ian Livingston. They were the joint shareholders but of course, Brian before then had another company called Asgard Miniatures. And so he was making fantasy miniatures for the emerging Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy gaming market. And they met, and at the time, Steve and Ian had got the rights to the Ralpartha molds that they got from Ralpartha, but they didn't quite know what to do with them. And so Brian said, well, I can do these. I know how to cast miniatures. I know how to do all this. And so they formed a joint venture that they announced, I think, in White Dwarf 11, 1979. They said, we're announcing Citadel Miniatures as a company. So the company's origins are absolutely in Games Workshop. But Citadel was in Newark, up in the Midlands, and Games Workshop was in London. They were separate entities with separate warehouses, separate factories, separate dispatch, separate accounting. And so when Brian took over the company, it just made no sense. You're paying all of this cost for London operations and you don't need it. And so that's what happened. And also in the interim, Rick and Tony Ackland, with Richard Halliwell as well, Hal, as he was known, had put together Warhammer 1. And Warhammer 1 went out the gate, and suddenly things started to move very fast indeed. But also Warhammer 1 was there because all the people in Citadel at the time, John and Alan Merritt, said, what the are people doing with all these miniatures? What are they doing with them all? How can D&D players be buying 20 or 30 goblins? Why were people building armies in their heads? They clearly need a game that they can play with these armies of goblins. And Rick and Hal had already published Reaper when they were 17 or 18. They'd written and published one game system, so that's how Warhammer came about.
Yeah, it was fascinating seeing that, even because seeing Rick mentioning that he spent a lot of time in the casting room, and the games design was sort of by necessity. yeah, you've done a game. Can you work on this? Richard Halliwell's done most of the work there. And just, can you add to it and tweak it and that the idea of people when they see, like you say earlier, the names Rick Priestley and the Chambers, people think about where they are now and the games that they've released. But at the time, it was a small cog within a small cottage industry.
Absolutely. And Andy started his career as a mail order troll over in Games Workshop as well, and Eastwood as well, putting dispatches out. You'll notice, and I know I'm talking for England here. Tell me to shut up. I love this book to pieces. The subtitle of the book is How the Lincoln Model Railway and War Game Society Changed the World. And I had to put a Facebook post up about that because people said, what the hell are you talking about? And the Lincoln Model Railway and War Game Society was a little club in Lincoln. And Lincoln is where Rick Priestley went to school. And he met his mate Richard Halliwell there, and another guy we interviewed called Tony Epworth. And there's another cat called Paul Elsie. These were teenage boys, 13 and 14. And they went along to the Lincoln Model Railway and War Game Society. And on the top floor of the house was the model railway. There's the old boys doing their landscapes and tracks and all of that. And downstairs there were some gaming tables. And these 13, 14, 15-year-olds would go and do war games. They'd do Ancients and they'd do, Romans and World War II and all of that. And then around that time, 75, fantasy started to take off. Lord of the Rings had been published and people were getting interested in fantasy. And so Rick and Hal kind of rocked up and said, we can write some decent war games rules here. We can write fantasy war games rules, which they did. And that became Reaper. And Reaper became Warhammer, and Warhammer plugged into Games Workshop. And this group of little boys in a hobby club in Lincoln ended up changing the world. That's what that story is about.
It's Lincoln's Beatles, isn't it?
It's Lincoln. and again, coming back to one thing you said earlier, Gerry, why did we write this? And actually, there is a sadness here, is that some of these voices are no longer here. We sadly lost Wayne England a few years ago, very tragically, very suddenly. We didn't expect to lose Wayne like that. Hal himself passed away a couple of years ago.
2021.
And so, 2021. And he was Rick's buddy. And actually, people are still catching up with Hal's games design. Space Hulk 1, just magnificent. Dark Future is, as you can see, I've got a Dark Future poster on my wall behind me because I love Dark Future. I think it was a game that never got the exposure that it should have had.
There you can see Blockmania, Dread, and second edition. That second edition is signed by Rick and Richard. I need to get Jervis and Brian. Maybe track them down.
And so we lost Hal, and we've lost Mike Brunson, who was one of the great characters of the early workshop, very involved in role play through Flame. We're losing these people. We had to get on with this. There was an urgency.
But, before the voices are gone forever. Obviously, the first volume, it's the shiny, the cool, the big names that people will be drawn to, the miniature designers, games designers, the artists, so on and so forth. The second book, though, contains a whole section listed under the salesmen, craftsmen, and cat herders. That's an interesting collective to put together. So can you tell us a bit about what went into taking their voices? Because I get the feeling from what I've seen and what I know and I've read in the past that the expansion of Games Workshop and Citadel Miniatures was as much because of the drive from the sales side as it was from the creative side, if we put it like that. So it went from being lots of RPGs and novels and books like that to going, okay, we're going to go more to miniatures and it seemed like it was more sales driven approach in that respect. Is that why they've been built in?
What's absolutely true is that Brian, who's a very wise man, he was very firm that sales was sales and studio was studio, and never the two should meet. Because he'd say, "Bloody salesmen! They want everything with an elephant on top, all made in gold. Tomorrow, please." And that's true. Salesmen always do. They always want something new, something different, and something that can sell as well as Space Marines every single day. And the studio, as Robin would say, I'll let Robin pick up on the studio. What Brian would deliberately isolate the studio, wouldn't he, Robin?
Absolutely. He didn't want the two things near each other because he thought that the creative people should just be able to create cool, exciting, spiky, angular, weird stuff and do that, and just do that. And don't worry about how many it's going to sell, but then pass that on to an operation. And that's what it's coming back again to your question is, why did we do it this way? Because the story of Games Workshop, although the kind of the rock and roll bit is maybe the studio where the characters are, that's only half the story. The reason Games Workshop is what it is today is because of the leadership of people like John and John's courage in actually saying to the retail guys, how would it be if you threw all the stuff, all your D&D and all of that other stuff out your stores, and we just sell Games Workshop product? Would that work, fellas? And John tells that story much better than I can. Building up a retail chain. Nobody had ever run a retail chain in the UK as selling orcs and goblins before. You must be out of your mind.
Particularly when we remember the time we were all doing it in the 1980s when everybody was getting computers, and everybody said, well, nobody's going to want a goblin to paint, for God's sake. And we fortunately just said, no, they're going to have a computer as well, is what we said. Every year the city would, or the investors would write us off saying, no, it's all going to go to computers, You don't know, you young lads. And I think, we'll see. We'll see who's the last man standing. And now look at them. Good God, what a monster they are.
And so it was a marriage, and that marriage was actually in Brian's head. He understood that, you can have your ivory tower and your people creating wonderful, shiny things, but unless somebody's got boots on the ground and is going to sell it to somebody for money so that you can keep making the cool stuff, so that you've got a profitable, viable business that is sustainable, then all of this is, you can make the nicest, prettiest, shiniest thing you like, but you're wasting your time. And it's that, go John.
And the genius of Brian, it sounds very obvious now in 2023 or wherever we are. The genius of Brian was there were two things he wanted. The one was astonishing quality in everything, in writing, in painting, in model. And secondly, fantastic customer service. So he built the sales machine the way he wanted it to be, and built the studio the way he wanted it to be. And then you add those two together, and quite often there are hundreds and hundreds of really good model makers out there or games designers out there at the moment, and they're great, but they don't necessarily have the selling ability or the marketing ability, or equally some great marketeers and a poor product. But you put the two together, and it's really very powerful, as you can see.
Towards the end, I mean, I'm just to endorse that point. There's a really great, really short story from Helen Morley, and nobody will have heard of Helen Morley outside of the Games Workshop family. But she tells a story of sitting there, Christmas Eve. Everyone else had gone down the pub. This is over at Chewton Street at the factory, and she's sitting on reception. And Brian walked past her, because he's still on site. And Helen says, oh, there's nothing worse than waiting for a phone to ring. And he paused and looked at her and said, there's nothing worse than waiting for a phone to be answered, and walked on. And that was Brian. That was Brian's customer service standard. That's why when the world was doing, you remember when you sent a postal order or a check to mail order and they said 28 days, and in these days of Amazon, you think you must be out of your mind. But that was the standard deal back in those days, 28 days mail order. Well, Brian would say, if it comes into the factory on a Monday, we can get that cast up, we can get it packed up, and we can get it out by Tuesday or Wednesday at the latest. Because guess what? That guy's just had his ass kicked over the weekend playing Warhammer with his mates. He wants to buy something cool and new, a big war machine. He wants it painted and on the tabletop the next Saturday. So we better get moving. And so he would turn orders around in 24, 48 hours back in the day when 28 days was the norm. That's Brian all over again. Yeah. He would, we all learned so much from him. He was a tough character. He didn't suffer fools. But boy, did we learn.
Well, then that's often what you require, a driving force to keep, a captain for the ship to keep everybody pulling in the same direction.
To keep all these crazy maverick rebels.
A cat herder.
A cat herder.
So Robin alluded to it there, John, but what was the drive then to focus solely on Citadel and on Warhammer? Was it just a sort of a cost analysis, or was the licensing issues getting in the way of?
Oh, what a great question! There are two things I'd say. There was certainly the margins you get when you're importing Dungeons and Dragons all the way from America, getting it shipped in, and then shipping it out again to Mar and Pa stores, the margins you get are vanishingly small on a book. And you can charge a lot more proportionally for a Citadel miniature, which you make yourself, cast in the back. So Brian quite correctly identified that as saying, well, if we sell X amount of boxes of miniatures, we make so much more money. And it's true. And the second thing was, in the end, it was a matter of absolute pride in selling Games Workshop stuff and Citadel miniatures. That's what we wanted to do, to try and do it on our own. And it was absolute, internal pride, saying, we must be able to do this. We will do this. And we will expand with Games Workshop quality product and quality service. So that was it.
Because the expansion, from what I remember from my youth, it was rapid. At a certain point, a certain tipping point, it just went very quickly. Because I remember the Giant Day sale, which was to mark the 50th store open in the UK, and then Apocalypse 100 to mark the 100th store, possibly worldwide, and they felt like they came within, maybe 4 or 5 years. It felt very, very close. It was together. A
small window, and again, that was Brian giving us the impetus and the go. And again, as Robin alluded to, none of us had a clue of what we were doing. None of us had ever worked in retail or in property, and we just thought, I'll tell you exactly how it all came about. I sat there and looked at the English football soccer league and said, right, who's in the first division? Sheffield, yes, heard of them. Yeah. Leeds, yes, we'll have one there. And then it got to second division. Who's in that? Carlisle, maybe, I don't know, whoever was in it. So that gave us our first 15 or first 21 stores. Then the next one was second division. Then Accrington Stanley we had to think about. But then I just got a map of every town and found where all the Marks and Spencers were. I think if there's a Marks and Spencers there, that's going to be good. Yeah. And then finally, we overlaid a piece of Perspex. I'll put in anywhere that had an early learning centre. I don't know if you had those over in the North of Ireland. Yeah. And that was tremendously working, middle-class place to be able to have. So we circled those like bomber missions. If they had those three things, then it was a cert. We think, we'll go there. And we'd try our best to get as close to the early learning centre as we could.
The store that I used to go to in Dudley was right opposite an early learning centre.
Early learning centres. Pete says that there are parents there who've got more money than sense when it comes to buying toys. Yeah. That's what
ideal.
It is, and we just knew they would have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on very clever estate agents negotiating these deals. I think it was good enough for them. It's good enough for us. So we just cut through that.
It's the Burger King to McDonald's analogy. McDonald's do all the research, and then Burger King just try and buy as close to McDonald's as they can.
I also remember, there was that point if that was the early 90s where we were kind of really talking that. And actually, obviously, the thing that happened in the early 90s is that Brian sold the company. And Brian sold the company to Tom Kirby, who was operations manager and had joined us from TSR. And then Tom went public. He floated the company. Because he was and he floated the company, which meant the company got an injection of capital, and a lot of things became possible then, opening stores, because there was some money from investors that could be spent to create a return on that investment, and that was going on. But it's interesting. I remember, John, and it was your initiative. I think we were in about 100 stores. And you were going through your ranking. We said, well, let's just see where the 200th least likely place to open a shop would be in the UK based on these rankings. And weirdly, it came up as Loughborough, which, of course, is only just around the corner from Nottingham. So we said, OK, let's go and open a store in Loughborough then and test this ranking system. And we opened a store in Loughborough, and it did just fine. And suddenly we went, shit, there's no end to this. Yeah. We can start putting stores in cities with 100,000 less, or almost large villages, small towns. That's what we could go for with that. And it was just a seat you pants, really exciting time. And I remember, if you look at these white dwarfs, every month I'm filling pages with new store opening, grand opening, new store opening every month after month. 2, 3, 4 stores a month were coming through those early white dwarfs.
And they used to ship out people from the studio to them all the time. I've got one sitting beside me, which I think might actually be the Loughborough.
Yeah, let's go.
I just have to look, because I know Mike McVeigh was being routed out of his bed to go and open it up and do some painting demonstrations as well.
If you remember as well, there'd be huge queues sometimes throughout the whole evening as well, throughout the previous night. People queuing up and sleeping outside.
Cambridge for their Warhammer Day, but yeah. Mike McVeigh and Wayne England set off to Cambridge on the 25th of January. I'm sure they were delighted with that trip early in the morning. But yeah, the big grand openings and the store days were always a thing of joy. It was like a mini Golden Demon coming to your town.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, which you didn't see. You know, when all of a sudden these flash rock star types with their miniature painting skills rocked up, it was like, well, you need to get there early. You need to be there and see them and see how much you can sort of squeeze out of the day.
Yeah, and the artists would go out. So Wayne England would go out, and you say miniature painters, and one of the games designers, Jervis, was always up for going and chatting to people about anything and everything, and it was great. It was great.
There's one question I want to ask, and I don't know if you remember, John. You probably won't, Robin, but there was a thing called Trollotype, which was the mail order trolls newsletter, where it looked like they got the first castings of a new upcoming product, took it to a photocopier, photocopied that page, and then cut badly round them, and then would photocopy these and send them out as part of the mail order newsletter, going, these are coming out, and you would get to see them about a month or so before they'd appear in a white dwarf. But you were there staring at this black grainy image that had been photocopied 100 times.
And think how exciting that would be.
It was magical. You were trying to desperately to work out what you were looking at.
So sometimes less is more, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, very
the
much.
Old days of pixelation version. That's really
yeah, exactly. There was a mantra that we all shared at Games Workshop in those years, because we were young men in a hurry back then. And the mantra was quick and dirty, done by 5:30, and that was our company mantra. Get on and fucking do it right now. Don't think about it. Get it done.
That was certainly how Trollotype came across to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it was just like, they say that I want them. I'm going to go out to them and say I probably do want them.
And as you say, putting a 3D miniature on a photocopier, it's got to look rubbish.
Oh, it was terrible, absolutely terrible. I still love to get them through the post though.
Whereas the first job you ever got in the studio as a new recruit was called blacking up miniatures, where you'd have to get the metal castings from the factory, and we actually use that liquid shoe polish. Yes. And you'd have to immerse them in liquid shoe polish and then get them out and clean it all off with a cloth and then we'd photograph them for the catalogue pages. That's how it was done in those days.
Yeah. Because, I mean, that in and of itself is interesting, because the very early miniatures, Tony Ackland did line drawings for them. So you would be told that there was a unit of female coming out, and you would get the little line drawings for each of them, for the shaman, for the war chief, and all the rest. And then you moved across to obviously having a higher production. So you got into the black lined miniatures, and then eventually everything would be sort of painted and lovingly displayed. You wouldn't really see the unpainted miniatures popping up as front and center so much that they got relegated to the back of the.
I will be honest, Gerry.
Dwarf.
If when you see some of the old studio miniatures, because it was such a frantic time at the studio, it's a bit like a breaking news stories. You had to get words and pictures out, by Friday. Quite often, the backs of the miniatures weren't actually painted. They just paint the front one.
People didn't see that bit.
So they didn't have time to paint the back. Always with the intention, I'm sure, of going back and finishing them. But
no, sure, they never run away on the battlefield, John. That's right.
It was not always what it seemed.
Yeah.
But the other thing, Gerry, is actually, again, this is going to sound baroque and weird, because people can, on their phones, they can produce top quality graphics. What's called halftone is really difficult and a really expensive process. So continuous tone, where you've got a line, that's really easy to reproduce. So Tony Ackland would do all those line drawings, because if you've got a photograph, you've then got to halftone it, and then you've got to go through a repro process. This is faster. But it was only when the volume was too much for Tony to do all of those drawings by hand. And I think in Tony's interview, he said that his maximum was something like 120 in one day. I can't remember what the number is, but that's the way it was done. There was no other way of doing it.
Wow.
There was absolutely no other way of doing it. And Go on.
But I was going to say, talking of illustrations, it was fascinating, and people can see this when they dive into the book themselves. But in the Bob Naismith bit, you see all of the fascinating sketches and stuff that he'd done for things that have then become miniatures later on. And these are like little treasures that you found and dug out of people's collections.
First rhinos.
Yeah,
those first model rhinos we saw, and Bob said, "Oh, I think I've got a load of." He said, "A wee load of those drawings at home," and he just pulled them out, and they're just biro on a notepad. Yeah. But that's what they are, and these are artifacts that we've got in that way. Sorry, my cat is really making a lot of noise outside the door. Bear with her.
Just as excited as we are about this.
She's just excited. She's saying, "Why can't I come in the room? Because I've shut the door on her." Normally, she sits on my lap in front of the computer, but. So my apologies for the cat.
I hope it's a great big furry one. Then you look like a Bond villain. It's on your lap.
Now, Mr. Bond. Now.
That's the one.
How much did the White Dwarf change then, Robin, whenever you took over as editor? Because obviously I have a fair chunk of the earlier stuff where it was more text heavy. And then even the sort of the early White Dwarves that you worked on yourself. They were still very avant-garde, freeform jazz almost. You got like maybe a miniatures rule one week and then a novelization of something the next week. There was a lot going on, but by the time your sort of reign as editor finished, it had become a lot more solidified into what people probably would still recognize today as a sort of a standard layout for White Dwarf.
Well, there's two parts of this, probably more than two parts. It actually depends on how much time you've got. But
there's all the time in the world. That's why he's here to stop me, and I can mute him. This
part of that story is when I first took over White Dwarf, and that was number 140. And it's largely the same, there's kind of 140. It's largely the same as it was. It's a mix of black and white and color pages and was made in very traditional. And lots of people talk about what a physical manual task it was putting books and pages together back in the old days, before computers. And I talk about when we got our first Mac SE30, tiny little Mac, with a little screen, and went, oh, look, you can change things on the fly. That was like magic world. But so the first half a dozen issues of White Dwarf that I took over, I was just kind of carried with the momentum of what had gone before. Mm-hmm. And I was stepping into some big people's shoes. Simon Forrest had the magazine for a year or so, and Mike Brunton before that. And I kind of went, ooh, I've just got to carry on doing this. And it took me half a dozen issues to go, actually, that, I can do what I want with this magazine, so long as it's cool. And a couple of things happened as we put in, I really got to grips with the technology, what we could do with an Apple Mac and Quark Express. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, we can go full color now. We don't have to do this combination of black and white and color. Let's go for full color. And again, I talk there's conversation in the book where Paul Sawyer and I talked together as White Dwarf editors with John in the chair as referee, mm-hmm. and about how that came about. The thing I'm most proud of on White Dwarf is battle reports. Mm. Absolutely most proud of battle reports, because the part of the reason I got the job at Games Workshop was because I'd had a battle report published in White Dwarf. So yeah, I think it was 107. I won't go reaching into my collection, but something like that. I was a youth worker in London. I was a games player, a role player, a war gamer, all of those things. But for a day job, I used to run a youth centre in Southeast London in Waterloo. And one of the things I was running Warhammer games with the kids in the youth club, and we played this game, and I wrote it up and I sent it to Games Workshop, and they published it. Mm-hmm. And I love battle reports. I used to read in the General magazine, which was Avalon Hill's magazine, squad leader battle reports, because I was a big squad leader player. And they had the two guys who were going to play the game, often the right of the game, talking about their armies, fighting the game, and then reviewing what happened. And I went, that was just so cool. We can do that for Warhammer, and we can do that for 40K. Yeah. So I went to, okay, Jervis and Andy, I want you to do this. Play a game, write it out, and we'll publish it. Mm-hmm. And again, that's the big thing that I changed. But standardizing some of those features, the other stuff down, saying, okay, this is great. Fans really like this. We'll have this every month. And they just kind of rolled into a much more steady format. We kept the role play stuff while we had Flame Publications running. So Flame Publications was Mike Brunton and Graham Davis and Tony Ackland, who had just dedicated to role playing stuff, and so they would contribute some pages. But White Dwarf, again, you have to imagine, White Dwarf came out once a month. And it was about 64 pages. And again, Paul says in his interview, people say to me, how long did it take to put a White Dwarf together? You go, it's a monthly magazine. And you go, yeah, but how long did it take to put together? You go, you've got about 21 days. That's about it. You've got 21 days with 7 days to get it to a printer and get it out into the stores before you hit the next one. So I would be wandering around the studio, going to the heavy metal games, going, what have you got as painted and finished? Of course, we know we're releasing these products, so those products need a splash. Yeah. So it's partly driven by sales. What's coming out this month? What do we need to promote? And how do we push the hobby? How do we do cool stuff for the hobby? How do you build that building? Owen Branham, you know how to make buildings. Make us a building and then break it apart and we'll print that. Show us how to paint this stage by stage. We were running around the studio grabbing stuff and shoehorning it to the magazine as best we could.
It's an absolute joy, and you're probably,
it's the truth of it.
Yeah, you're probably responsible for my love of battle reports, which I constantly berate our community to put more battle reports up on our website on a regular basis because I just love them. Always,
can you imagine?
Always will.
Can you imagine those early battle reports where, to make the maps for those battle reports, we had the map and then we had bits of paper that was sticky, and then we'd move them around, stick them down, take a photograph of that, and then for the next, move all these sticky bits of paper and bits dropped off on the floor. And they were a nightmare. And then they'd have to be hand colored, no computers. We just
don't tell me that.
Insane.
Everything about it was beautiful and lovely, and you loved doing every minute.
It was magic.
Down all the trees.
Well, it was magic. And at the end of the month, when it came in from the printers, and we'd look at it, we'd go, "Wow, that looks really cool," or we can do that. I mean, it was just magic.
Trouble with White Dwarf coming out at the end of every month is when it arrived in the factory, everybody got a copy, and nobody did any bloody work for the last 3 hours on a Friday. Everybody would go off to the bathroom with a White Dwarf, and so in the end we had to give it out on the Monday so we could get Friday afternoon's work done.
It's true. It would bring the company to a halt, as it should do. Again, from sitting here in 2023, it's hard to imagine. Pre-95, no internet, no email. No World Wide Web. How did you get information about your hobby? You bought a magazine. Yeah. And what was in that magazine was exciting, not just to the people who went to W.H. Smith's or the local newsagents and got the copy, but the rest of the company as well. Everyone's going, wow, cool, what's out next month? All the guys in retail stores. It would just put a rocket into them when White Dwarf came out. It was the pulse of the company. Yeah. And the pulse of the hobby at that time.
Which is probably a good place to leave it there. Because otherwise I will talk on for hours and hours, and then our editor will strangle me.
You've broken him, Robin.
But, sorry.
You haven't broken me at all. It's fantastic.
But the main thing is there are even more stories like these in Talking Miniatures.
Oh, God, we've barely scratched the surface of this.
We haven't given you any of the good ones yet. You've got to buy the book for that.
Well,
got to get those, yeah.
It's the best way forward. So if people are looking to buy it, they can go to talkingminiatures.co.uk.
That's correct.
Do you have any copies of the pre-order left, or will you set a specific amount that you're going to go to print with?
No, we've not. What we set, we did 50 that have been signed by all of the participants. They're individually numbered 1 to 50, and we sold those, I think, in about an hour and a half, 2 hours, Johnson. They've all gone, and people saying, "Are you going to do any more?" We go, "We really can't." We've been UPSing these bits of paper around the UK to various locations for a while. Yeah. John and I have committed to every single person that pre-orders, we will sign their copy of the book. Both of us will sign the front of it to say thank you for pre-ordering and showing confidence in the book and us. It's a book you've not read yet. You're just going to have to trust that it's cool. We are pen ready. I did the calculation the other day. I went 20 seconds of signature, that's 3 a minute, that's about 150 an hour. I don't know how many books we're going to sell, but we could hopefully be for a day or more. That would be really cool. The book has now gone to the printers, so there's now a gap of about 3 weeks for the printed versions to arrive in Warlords Warehouses, because we're using John's company as a distribution setup for this. After those volumes arrive, we'll no longer sign copies.
Okay.
But it will then go out on Amazon, and it will be still available for direct sale through Warlord Games. So we are going to sign every single pre-order. So if you want a signed copy, pre-order it now.
Get across and get it ordered. It seems like there is room for maybe a third volume down the line.
That's a scary prospect, Gerry. Given that this one took 5 years.
Just rattle another out and find it. But obviously, there are people that you couldn't talk to when you were putting this together at the time, and some of which have subsequently retired, like John Blanche is now.
Well, John has retired, but John would be a book in his own. John would be a book in his own right. I don't think we would need to share. We would need to do Talking Miniatures 3. And there are other people that we'd have loved to talk to. Obviously, Ali Morrison would be a great companion to Trish Carden's interview. Jez himself is still working at Games Workshop. We were lucky with Jervis that Jervis retired last August, and he was contractually free to talk to us. And so he was one of the last interviews we did for the book, and was lovely as well.
Well, time will tell. Never say never, isn't that what they say?
Never say never. We don't know. We'll see how. Yeah. Let us see how this one goes. If this strikes a chord and people like it and enjoy it, and we get some good feedback, and people are enthusiastic about what we've done, we'll think about some more maybe.
Yeah. Well, just to throw my 2 cents behind it, I've only had a look at a couple of the chats, and for somebody of my age, it is nostalgia writ large. It ticked all the boxes, and it was great. Not just seeing an old white dwarf and going, "I've got that," or seeing a bit of art and then hearing the story behind it, or hearing how Tony would draw random bits of armor and armament and just give those to the Perrys, and they could sort of combine them into their sculpts rather than giving them fully developed things.
Did you like the crotch hatch dragon?
That story was amazing. I love that.
And then immediately after that, there was an Emperor Dragon miniature show, and I've got that as well. So for somebody my age, absolutely. If you got into Games Workshop Warhammer during this period, there's so much to look at and to digest. For the younger audience, the people who maybe didn't grow up during this golden period, but have come in afterwards, the stories in here are amazing, and it shows you just how the company and the games and the miniature side all developed sort of in tandem, synergistically. That's a good word.
That sounds very organized. It wasn't very.
No, but just feeding off each other like piranhas in a tank. Just back and forth until one almighty piranha came to the top, and Talking Miniatures covers all of that and so much more. So thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
It's been a pleasure. It's been great. And it's very nice to hear that feedback from you, Gerry. I mean, John and I set out to write the book we wanted to read. And it's,
I think
if that's what we've done, that's great.
It's 17 great chats in the pub. On that note, we shall leave you. And if you have any questions or anything you want to ask the guys, drop them below. You may get an answer. They may be done with writing, though. Otherwise, we'll speak to you again soon.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.